Hey, folks, welcome back to another episode of Broken Brains with your host, Bruce Parkman, sponsored by the Mac Parkman Foundation, where we look at the issue of repetitive brain trauma in two forms: repetitive head impacts from contact sports and repetitive blast exposure from military veterans in their service, and how both these conditions are contributing to the mental welfare of our kids, adults, and veterans, and why this is so important, because the connection between repetitive brain trauma and mental illness, i.e. brain damage, is not taught in our nursing, medical, and suicide prevention training courses. And that makes us the front line of knowledge for you, the parents, the stakeholders, the caretakers, to become informed about these situations so that you can take care of the ones you love. And on this podcast, we bring on authors, researchers, patients, professional football players, amateurs, parents of those that have lost, and researchers and scientists to discuss this. So you have that 360-degree perspective of this issue, because you are literally the first line of defense when it comes to protecting those that you love, as we said. On the show today, another amazing guest. We have with us today Dr. Allison Breger. Breger? I said that right, ma'am?
But it's
Breger.
all right.
Breger. Sergeant Major in English, man. Bad combination. Tell you that right. Dr. Allison Breger is a neurobiologist and one of the nation's leading experts on sleep, circadian rhythms, and human performance. She serves as an assistant professor at the United States Military Academy at West Point, HUA, and as a Ghost Fellow with U.S. Special Operations Command. Her work spans clinical trials and field studies with special forces and elite performers operating in some of the world's most extreme environments, from Antarctica to the Central American rainforest. 7 Special Forces Group, been there multiple times. Dr. Breger advises organizations such as NATO, U.S. SOCOM, NASA, and the Army Surgeon General on fatigue, resilience, and neuroenhancement. And she helped write the U.S. Army's Holistic Health Doctrine, as well as the NCAA's first mental health handbook. She's published more than 50 scientific papers and contributes regularly to national science outlets, and is the author of Meathead, Unraveling the Athletic Brain. Ma'am, Dr. Allison Breger, welcome to the show. How are you doing today, ma'am?
I'm doing great. We're getting a snowstorm soon, so I'll be tuckered in for the next few days.
Wow, man. You guys do get some bad weather up there at West Point.
Yeah, we're supposed to get like 7 inches over the next hour.
Haven't been up there a while, and from what I hear, I don't plan to be up there. I had a lot of friends that served. One is the commander of the 10th Mountain Division. It was not a lot of fun.
No, I agree. I'm not a cold weather person myself, having spent, a lot of my last assignment down in Florida. I'm really craving that Florida weather now.
Well, that's where I'm right now, and it's not as nice as it was yesterday, 80 degrees and sunny, but I'll take it anyways. I really don't care. So all good. So, ma'am, what led you on this journey? How did you get into neurobiology, neuroscience? What led you?
So it's really from being an athlete. So I was a gymnast, more or less like a high risk athlete growing up. So I did gymnastics from the age of 2 all the way through high school. And then in high school, I actually picked up pole vaulting too. I grew up in Ohio, and actually girls weren't allowed to pole vault in Ohio until I was about a junior because it was considered too dangerous. But as soon as girls were allowed to pole vault, my track coach basically recruited all the gymnasts and forced us to pole vault. But it was a great event to pick up because I ended up going on to college, competing in pole vault. And then I did, after college, try to make the Olympic team, the 2008 team. I wasn't successful. But it was around that time that I had fallen in love with taking neuroscience courses where I went to college, which was Brown University. And I think why I was so fascinated by it is because of being a gymnast and putting my body in very dangerous situations and doing these complex advanced skills and not really thinking about it. But that whole process of how does one go from throwing their body in every which direction, upside down, and risk injury, and do it time after time, day after day, and go back to it, even when you have, a near miss or a fall or something like that. So that's what fascinated me with neuroscience. So throughout my career, I've always tried to center my research and relate it back to athletes and give back to athletes, not just through research, but also coaching. I've coached high school, track and field ever since graduate school. And I'm also involved with a lot of nonprofits now, for example, to help soldiers who are about to retire refine their purpose through coaching and stuff as well. So, more or less, I feel like my entire career, even with TBI, for example, that we'll talk about today, has been centered around athletes because I have done a lot of work with the NCAA, the NFL, and then also some of the research we've done in the early days at Walter Reed.
We can stay on the athletic track this whole time. I mean, of course, that's how we got going was, my son's overexposure to subconcussive trauma from contact sports. And it's interesting that a lot of people don't associate with gymnastics with what we call repetitive head impacts. And while it's not just RH. So let's talk about that because, Simone Biles came out a couple of years ago struggling with mental illness. And people would come to me and say, what do you think? And I was like, well, can you think of how many times that young lady has hit her head on a beam, on the bar, in practice with all those crazy flips? And they're like, wow, we never thought about that.
Yeah.
That should be an issue of concern for parents when they look at these sports.
Absolutely. I mean, I forget how old Simone Biles is. I'm 41. So I am of that generation where the word concussion really didn't even exist in high school. And I can at least recollect 3 times, essentially, like on floor exercise and then also beam too, where I was trying to add a new twist or say an additional flip to my already existing skill repertoire. And yeah, I've landed on my neck. Fortunately, I've never damaged or, to the best of my knowledge, injured my neck. But I do remember like all those subconcussive and even concussive symptoms that we now know of and we ask athletes about as soon as they get hit. Like I definitely experienced. It's just at the time we didn't know what they were. I did have 2 concussions from pole vault too. Again, during the time period where I you didn't know much about it, right? I remember, like, clearly having a moment of, like, blacking out, but then I, like, still competed throughout the meet, and then I had a massive headache the next day, but again, we didn't know what we didn't know back then. And the same is true in the military too. In pole vault, where it happened was the first time was if you think about the pole, right, it has to be oriented a certain way because it bends a certain way. And if you don't turn the pole over that certain way when you're planning in the box, it will shoot you in whatever direction. So that's basically what happened is it catapulted me right into the standards, the metal standards that hold up the crossbar.
Gosh.
And I smacked my temple pretty hard. And then the second time you've probably seen that like social media video of a male vaulter when he releases the pole and the pole hits a not so friendly area. That's very common in males. But I had that same thing happen, except where my eye socket is I was releasing the pole. I was coming down with gravity and my pole came and hit me right in the eye. And I definitely felt a little concussed after that too. But again, we didn't know what we didn't know at the time. I remember Brown had just started doing concussion protocol stuff. Like they were one of the first people in the game, them and Virginia Tech, because the football players at Brown back then were wearing the sensors integrated into the helmets to look at the cumulative total load and intensity of subconcussive hits. But I would say outside of football, the other sports like gymnastics, track and field, even, other non-contact sports like swimming, like concussions really weren't thought of, but think of how many people have probably hit their head on like the side of the pool.
Right. And the only difference is those, as we know, is those sports, they concussions and concussive events they're not part of the sport. They're not accident. They could be, like you said, poor form, poor style, but they're not part of the sports like they are in soccer or, hockey. And, so, but it is interesting that parents are like, wow, but gymnastics is a whole nother, that's like wrestling to me, right? It's like, it is a contact sport. The head moves violently. The risk for the head trauma is pretty high. And then what's your opinion of, there was some studies at one of the brain conferences I was looking at the G forces that are driven by these, I mean, really, those triple moves and all that. And all of a sudden you stop, but the brain don't stop, right? Because it's in fluid. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing where the biggest risk for issues arises because of the repetitive nature of it. And the perfect example I can give you related to military operations, because we have done a lot of work in this space too, is like the opening shock of the parachute during military free fall, or actually what's even worse than free fall, sometimes is static line jumping,
No
right?
way.
Yeah, just because
I've
of the
done both, so I'm all curious now. So what you got?
well, and the landing too, right? At least in free fall, you have like a more gentle landing most times. So,
Yes.
static line, yeah, it's up to you and God and the winds as to like how you're gonna land, right?
Okay, so explain to the audience because we have a lot of civilians who read this. So, all right, so the difference between halo and or free fall and static line, and then what there is. So there's a significant difference in the opening shocks between. They all stunk for me. I wasn't a big. I jumped a lot, but I wasn't a big fan.
Yeah. So the basic difference is static line. It's exactly what it is. You jump out of that plane and that parachute releases. The difference is it's the altitude, right? It's only about 1,800 feet. But the chute, in terms of how it's designed, it is creating a very disruptive and very violent opening. And because of that opening in your body being subjected to or to velocity, it's going to jolt your body around. Now, if you add on altitude, so high altitude, low opening, essentially you're jumping out of a plane at about 13,000, we'll even say like 23,000 feet, depending on the circumstance. Um, but you are free falling and you're reaching terminal velocity. And then around 5,000 feet, that's when you pull the chute to open the canopy. The chutes are designed differently. So they're designed to have uh, to absorb more of the shock. But because you have been falling at terminal velocity for the last 12,000 feet, is th- it's still going to be a pretty disruptive and violent opening. And so if you're doing that not just once a day, but several times a day, compounded by weeks on end, it's going to have a significant impact, right? To equate it to gymnastics, to your point, or wrestling, it's fine if you're doing that move once, but in any gymnastics practice, you're not just doing that move or that skill on a single instance. You're doing it like every 90 seconds, essentially, for at least 45 minutes. So that's where the cumulative trauma becomes a concern. And sure, your body, like from the research I know, your body does adapt and adjust to those physical forces, just like, right? There's this idea that if a high school football player was tackled at full intensity and effort by an NFL player, it would probably kill him. So your body does adapt, but at what point does the adaptation stop and the harm take over? And that's more
Yeah.
or less what we're interested in, especially with some of the research we do now, is what is the cost benefit of ratio where we can still achieve the training effect, but at minimal cost.
Yeah, and that brings up some good points that I want to dial into later because I was on General Fenton's brain health team. I was fortunate enough to be invited into SOCOM a couple times and sit there and when you're wrestling with lethality and mission, the desire to go, and then you got all these you know angry men and women that want to train, right? Getting them to understand that that you have a life after the military, right? And we have to protect that brain. But let's get back to gymnastics and wrestling, all this in children's brains. Okay, a child's brain that doesn't develop till 25, and of course, women develop a lot faster than men, and we all know that because we act like idiots. And then of course, you're an adult at 18, you can do whatever you want with your undeveloped brain. What can we do right now to just kind of we know now we cannot deny this anymore that these impacts are they're in no way beneficial to brain health. They're not. And sports should be fun. Sports should be productive. And yes, we have so much to gain from sports. I played all army rugby, semi-pro rugby. I was Green Beret. I've done all the team stuff, right? Love being on a team. Everybody wants to be on a team, right? But there is a growing recognition right now that these forces are unnecessary when a kid's brain is developing. Yet we've got gymnasts competing on Olympic teams in their what? How old are these kids? 15,
Barely
15?
16, like, they're barely old enough to drive
Barely old enough to drive, and how long have they been beating their brains around?
since they
And
were as
so, I
long as
mean,
I've
it's
since they were 2 or 3.
right. So we've got it's just like and when you start looking at the religion of these, like you could pick a sport, gymnasts, hockey players, you got NFL guy, let's start them at 5. Let's always start younger, 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 younger. And now we understand, like back in the 70s, this stuff, well, I mean, gymnasts, yes. I mean, the gymnasts were always cultivated at a very young age for decades, right? But we didn't have a lot of Pop Warner. We didn't have all this club soccer. We didn't have all this sports stuff that's kind of been pulled down through whatever you want to call it. You want to call it greed, you want to call it, whatever, passion, whatever. We're exposing our children to a lot of head trauma. Do you have any any ideas on what we can do to, because it looks like it's going to be a significant societal shift to say, look, our gymnasts are going to compete as adults, which is going to limit the amount of crazy moves that they can do because they don't have the suppleness and what they can do as a child athlete. But we are hurting these kids.
I think the biggest thing outside of like preventative measures and perhaps reducing the reps and sets, which again, the reps and sets are necessary, but you have to do a scientific evaluation of at what cost, right? Just like at with military free fall, like, okay, how many times a day can we jump or how many rounds should we have in a shoot house before it's time to stop, where we've achieved the objective and we're not reaching this point of diminishing returns and harms. So outside of that, I think the one thing that is different now compared to when I was an athlete in high school and college is kids don't have an off season. So at least right during preseason and competition season, that's where you're going to have the most cumulative trauma. And that's true for gymnastics too. So we actually would have an off season. And what I mean by that is during the summer, like that was for strength and conditioning and skill development. So we would have 3-hour, 4-hour practices 4 times a week in the summer, but we'd spend 2 of those hours doing aerobic conditioning and or right, more like CrossFit stuff before CrossFit was a
Mm.
thing. And then in terms of skill development, we would either refine, like if we were doing rotations or say release moves, we would focus on those, but we wouldn't like do skills to completion. We only really focus on stringing all those rotations and release moves together during the preseason and the actual season. And I think that's the most preventative thing people can do is to have an actual off season. Because you're not gonna, right? You're not gonna forget those skills, right? Those skills have been executed thousands of times. So they're encoded into muscle
Program.
memory. And sometimes you do need that break, right? Biles talked about that when she developed the twisties and she had to take like months off from being in the gym to more or less like reset and rewire her brain in order to do that. But I think that's the biggest thing that needs to be implemented here more than anything.
I do not disagree. I mean, I think that right now we just think that P is for plenty, right? And we've got and I was just talking to a chiropractor who's actually a concussion. He wrote the concussion protocols for one of the states here in the U.S. And he was telling me that, that these kids are specializing in the same sport and it's causing huge problems because you work other muscle groups. They don't, and so this whole age of being a 2 or 3 sport athlete is, or in the case of my son, where it was 2 concussive sports that hurt him, right? It wasn't, if he would have played baseball and football and anything, or had there been a break, to your point, between football and we're trying to get this one state right now to separate these 2 sports so the kids can have an off season in between. And this is the kind of, the logic that I think needs to be applied to some of these. And then of course, these kids just got to be kids, if you
Yeah,
ask me.
exactly. They're not, it breaks my heart when I see just the amount of focus that these kids have. No, I mean, it's respectable, but right, burnout is real. It doesn't matter who you are.
It is. Let's talk about some of the environmental impacts on I mean, you've been working with people in Antarctica, and while this is a little bit off topic, it is kind of interesting. Having sweated in the jungle for 11 years down in Central South America, I mean, I'm pretty big. I used to cramp up all the time. And we have a lot of athletes that listen to this. What are you learning from these studies on whether it's the coldest of colds or operating in jungle and or desert environments? We just got done with 20 years of you
Yep.
know conflict over there.
I mean, so we were doing sleep studies in all these environments, to include in the Middle East. So during the war, we were part of a mental health advisory team that was sent out by the Pentagon to basically capture sleep objectively using sleep watches and active combat zones, and then correlate that with performance, but also mental health. I think in all these environments, whether it's Arctic, jungle, or desert warfare, it all comes down to adaptation. And that's just how incredible the human body is at adapting on its own. So when we were doing this study in Antarctica, for example, and this is all published research, it was actually with the Argentinian Navy. They have a very small Navy base in the southernmost part of the world, called Belgrano 2. And they share that base with like NASA researchers and or researchers who study environmental issues. So we studied their sleep objectively using a sleep watch, for an entire year, 24 hours of light, 24 hours of dark, and then the twilight period in the spring and fall. We also looked at blood pressure. We looked at core body temperature every single day, twice a day. And then we also had them do a test of reaction time for 2 to 3 minutes. And what was really interesting is the body would adapt with every season. So during the 24 hours of darkness, the people who were stationed down there, essentially, they had longer sleeping bouts and fewer bouts in a 24-hour period. So instead of taking a 20-minute nap, they would take a 75-minute nap and do that 3 times versus taking a 20-minute nap 6 times. During the summer, it was the opposite, where they would have a very short sleeping bout, but sleep more frequently. So if you looked at a 24-hour average, it all amounted to about 7 hours of sleep in a 24 hour. And sure, some of that was structured because of their schedule, right? Just like astronauts stationed on the International Space Station, they have a list of tasks and duties that they have to complete during the day in order to achieve their mission and objectives down there. But really, this is just like ad libitum on your own sleep amounts. It all amounted to 7 hours. What that meant for physiology is blood pressure essentially stayed the same, core body temperature rhythms stayed the same, and then tests of reaction time, at least when we tested them, were about the same because the body was able to adapt in those environments. And it's the same thing when you look at heat acclimation. That's why there's such a huge, huge focus. And there's an entire research institute at Natick Labs in Boston dedicated to the study of altitude and heat acclimation, because there is a way to do it and there's a way to do it right. But the body can adapt to these environments if it's given the opportunity. I mean, I'll like as a silly anecdote, when we were part of this mental health advisory team and we were going out we were mostly in Kuwait, which was in February, high 90s, wearing kit all day for 16 hours a day. It was only 20 degrees back then in DC. It was like a really, really cold winter in DC. So I actually would go to the local hot yoga place right near Capitol Hill, like every day after work for 5 weeks. And I would do hot yoga for 90 minutes to 2 hours in my BDUs just to like acclimate. And so when we finally were boots on ground in Kuwait, I was completely fine because I had spent 5 to 6 weeks prior in the 30 and 20-degree weather acclimating my body to those conditions.
Good for you. Well, we also know that sleep is also an indicator that the brain is struggling at times. And we see this with, soldiers that have suffered from repetitive blast exposure. Also, a lot of the athletes that are suffering from repetitive ed impacts and the impacts in their brains are suffering. My son suffered from sleep deprivation. We finally understood, after we kind of put it all together after he left. So from the correlation, just for the education of our audience, with sleep, if somebody has had extensive blast exposure and or repetitive ed impacts, which is from contact sports, how is sleep impacted, and what can what can be done to improve sleep? Because it's so obvious. I think one of the reasons our son left us is that he was just so tired, and he was just at a point where impulsivity took over, and he couldn't.
Yeah, it's this has been more or less my life's work, and I've even done this type of work in animal models too, like 15 years ago. Sleep is the integral mediator of recovery, and also not just short-term recovery, but long-term recovery from any sort of traumatic brain injury, whether it's open head wound, closed head wound, even things such as ischemic stroke. So 15 years ago, when I was doing my fellowship after my PhD at a medical school, we did this neat thing where we gave mice essentially ischemic strokes. And right after they had their ischemic stroke, which damaged essentially half their brain, we gave them an opportunity to sleep or to be sleep deprived, like what used to be, right, the old recommendation when you had a concussion was you should never sleep after you have a concussion. You have to stay awake. And we found that the extent of recovery post ischemic stroke in the mice that were sleep deprived and weren't provided with an opportunity to sleep after the stroke, their brains never recovered, right? They had lost all movement on that side of where the stroke was, and those who were allowed to sleep showed significant recovery. And so that was, right, small animal evidence showing, okay, this medical recommendation that has been ubiquitous and universal for so long, this is one reason why it's not true. But now we have evidence from this just from human work as well in terms of the importance of sleep. Actually, this paper is coming out any day now. So this is a study we did when I was at the Center for Military Psychiatry at Walter Reed. We did a study where we recruited football players in the Maryland area, so collegiate football players. And so we worked with the athletic trainers of Division I football teams, well, Division I through Division III football teams around Maryland, to basically, as soon as a football player had a concussion, we would enroll them in our study. And then after they had returned to play from their concussion, they would come to the sleep lab at Walter Reed and essentially do what most college students do and or someone in the military would do, is they would stay up for 24 hours, right? Whether it's a field training exercise or pulling an all-nighter to study for an exam. And what was interesting is, although this was months after they had recovered from the concussion and had effectively returned to play, all those symptoms that they experienced post-concussion would return during the sleep deprivation, and they could not focus. They could not attend to any of the cognitive tasks we gave them. And then one of the most interesting things we found, and again, this should be coming out any day in the Journal of Biological Rhythms research, is that their restorative sleep amounts, so the type of sleep important for growth hormone release, testosterone release, as well as other anabolic factors for the brain and the body, had been reduced after their concussion. So at baseline, they already had less restorative sleep. And even during the recovery period from the sleep deprivation, they still had reduced restorative sleep. So it did do something to the ability to achieve restorative sleep, not just in the short term, but in the long term, well after they were quote unquote deemed medically cleared to play. So it does, that study doing it was a little difficult because I started thinking back to, right, the supposed concussions, although never diagnosed, and pole vault and gymnastics. And it's certainly good information to know moving forward, but one of those things that it can show you just how pervasive and impactful concussion can have on your long-term health and performance.
And this is just an concussion. A concussion. This is not like participating in a contact sport,
Right,
which is
exactly.
that's amazing. As a matter of fact, I need to get some of the information for the revision of our book, because now we're talking about impacting, and so I guess it could be postulated that If this is happening to a college athlete, these
Mhm.
same symptoms will be happening to a child that also not only has a concussion, but also a subconcussive lifestyle.
Yeah, I'll send you one of our already published components of this study too. So I guess we also looked at molecular factors. So throughout the day, right? Every day, our DNA, RNA is read so that we can continue to live life and to thrive and perform function. So something happens to the DNA sometimes under trauma, particularly brain trauma, called methylation, where you will have these methyl groups attached to the DNA that interferes with their ability to read the amino acids correctly. And so that's actually something else we found in this study too, and it's already published in bioarchives, and I can send it to you, is we did find evidence for DNA methylation in some of these encoding regions of genes related to sleep and circadian function in these college football players who had been deemed medically cleared from having a concussion.
Medically cleared, yeah. I mean, it's going to be right now. Our focus, and we keep talking to people about this, is that unless we can reduce the total aggregate amount of trauma that these brains are taking, we are not going to fix this problem. I mean, and as long as we allow children to start playing at younger and younger ages, I mean, we have no idea the contribution to this epidemic of mental illness in our youngsters that sports is contributing to. Just, I mean, it's all unintentional, right? Nobody's out to harm their children, but it's because we're uneducated. And I have talked to, and I'll ask you, as a neuroscientist, are you going to allow your children to play contact sport?
That is an interesting question because right, it's like, I know well, here's the thing is I also grew up I struggle with this. I've had this conversation with myself a lot because I grew up in Ohio. I have family who played in the NFL. My great uncle was a linebacker for the New York Giants, Lou Slaby, and then my distant cousin played for the New England Patriots, who's a backup quarterback to Tom Brady, Brian Hoyer. Like, growing up
Mr. Hoyer.
in, like, football America, Youngstown, Ohio, that's where I grew up. It's pretty well known for football. That's what you do growing up is you play football if you have a boy. But yeah, I'm not so sure I would now, knowing what I know.
The thing is what we're asking for is like, look, if we could just delay contact until high school, when the prefrontal cortex, the most important part of our brain, starts to develop, and then if we could just say, okay, can we have contact 2 hours a week, right? Save it for game day, because like all these boys aren't going to the NFL. Sorry, they're not Youngstown, Ohio guys, right? But, we could reduce the trauma, right? We could reduce it, make the sport safer, and then these children can grow up to be like you. They can be neuroscientists, neurobiologists. And one of my buddies came out of, I think it was Youngstown. It was a very poor, he played at Pitt. And there's this massive rivalry between Pitt and this other. He brought me, he was a Pitt team captain, Mike McGlynn.
Okay. That's where my great uncle played, Lou Slaby. He was at Pitt before he got drafted by the Giants and the
Okay.
Lions.
Mike McGlynn played in the NFL for 8 years, good friend of mine. And his son plays, and and he says, bro, he said, in my town, if you didn't play football, you couldn't get out. And he's adamant about it. We've talked about it. But that's the way it is in these towns. Like I'm in Florida right now, football city. And it's like, all right, do you really want to harm your children? So that we're coming to a compromise, because there is a compromise, like everything. Just like going back to the military, looking at how much time you're going to spend in that shoot house. I mean, how many times do you have to shoot that AT-4 before you can know how to shoot an AT-4, right? I mean, it's like you said, it's all about programming. Yeah, well, thank you for taking that question. I appreciate
No,
it.
it's something I've thought about, but I think to your point is like I would let my child play contact sports, but with the understanding that they would have an off season and they would do other things. Like there is a whole legitimacy to the strength and conditioning, and like the more you strengthen your neck muscles, the more it's going to reduce the impact and the velocity and the forces of the concussion.
Let's talk Let's talk about that real quick if we could, because I've heard this over and over again. It was validated by a doctor, but I'd like you to talk about this. The impact of a soccer ball on a female's anatomy vice a male.
Mhm.
There is significant science out there that, giving the way God built women with a longer neck to body ratio and a weaker neck muscle structure, that these soccer balls are hitting our girls with significantly more impact. Like, I've seen estimates of up to 70% more impact than a boy. What's your perspective on that?
No, I mean, physiologically, you're absolutely right, right? We don't testosterone is one hell of a drug. Like, when you have testosterone, you build bulk muscle, you build muscle quickly. You know, women, yes, we're capable of building muscle, but it's not going to be the breadth and depth that a male can. And so, even if you are doing like neck focused exercises, the male is still going to make significant gains more quickly than any female can.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because, well, that's the other unfortunate side of it, is women are highly underrepresented in a lot of the studies that are being done, and I think that's part of the focus, that even on the military side, like, there's hardly been any studies done on, we've had, a lot of female EOD personnel. There's a lot of female paratroopers out there, and you're talking about an opening shock on a neck with the same helmet that a man has, and those helmets, I've jumped at everything. And there's a lot of traumas going on. And I don't even think I'm working with the military. Well, you know what a GBEV is? The generalized blast exposure variable. Okay.
My friend Claire, she's a neuroscientist with the Navy. She helped create the GBEV when she was
Really?
at.
Yeah. And,
Yeah,
and
we
the,
worked in like the same division essentially.
yeah, the GBEV doesn't even take into account other forms of subconcussive trauma like combatives and parachute jumping. It's all blast, right? But yet it all comes together when we start talking. Now, I noticed that, when you wrote the mental health playbook or the handbook for the NCAA. Tell us about that. How'd you get involved with that?
Yeah, so I got involved with that through the Professional Sleep Research Society. Essentially, the NCAA, they wanted to bring together all professional societies across holistic health. So, mental health, nutrition, sleep, psychology, psychiatry, to help write this handbook. Sadly, the handbook came out of increased suicides across the NCAA. In 2013, the amount of suicides that year was the highest the NCAA had ever seen. And they realized they couldn't ignore this problem anymore of not having sufficient and adequate mental health resources in universities. I can tell you, when I was an athlete at Brown, we had very few resources. And, unfortunately, I was from a generation of female athletes where I had teammates who had eating disorders and or the mental health struggles that come with that. So the NCAA, this was their initiative to increase the amount of mental health resources as well as money allocated to mental health at all their institutions, Division 3 through Division 1 and NAIA. So it's really a collaborative effort to break down mental health holistically. So to look at sociocultural factors, for example, the fact that there are differences in terms of how much an athlete is willing to trust a coach to handle their mental health issues appropriately, how much they're willing to disclose based on whether they're male or female or whatever their race, ethnicity is, or even what sport they play, or are they varsity or JV? And then we focus mostly on the sleep component, just again, everything I talked about with this research, how sleep really is a protector and a mediator of recovery from not just TBI, but also to help reduce risk for any mental health issue, whether it's clinical or subclinical. And so that's what I worked a lot with the NCAA. Essentially, we would meet quarterly and come up with a series of guidelines. So they get all of us in the room, the sports psychologists, the psychiatrists, the clinical psychologists, the dietitians, the sleep clinicians, and just write and athletic administrators too, right? Because you had to make it feasible, scalable, and realistic for whatever institution it was. And it was like a 2-3 year effort, but the handbook is now available online. I know they have started working on future editions. And there was a lot of nonprofits involved with this too. And some of the nonprofits were focused on youth sports. So it wasn't just, it was preceding college sports as well.
Did they look at the correlation between suicides and the types of sports that were being played? Was there any focus on the issue of subconcussive trauma, repetitive and impacts, and maybe any contributions to the suicides that were taking place, unfortunately?
Yeah, so that was one of the trends that was appearing. I don't know if it's specifically in the handbook, but the trend that, right, in contact sports, there's a trend towards increased suicide for all the reasons that we now know.
Yeah, and that's what it was so important to get out there, and that's why, it's it's just it's time. It's time that we just can't sit here and ignore this any longer in the face of, I don't care, fame, money, fortune, whatever, dude. We have to effect some changes. Doctor, you've done a lot in a 41-year-old, for a 41-year-old woman, and you have done a lot in your career. What's the most interesting study that you've been a part of or so far that maybe
Well, at
we
first
haven't
I thought
talked
you were
about
gonna
yet?
ask what is the most interesting fact about me? I was
We'll
gonna
get to
say
that next. We haven't
okay.
asked that question yet, but go ahead.
Really, I think that it's the study in Antarctica, that was the most fascinating because I was not expecting for physiology to balance out in an environment like that. That totally blew my mind, but it makes sense, right? If you look at how long people are able to, survive and thrive in space and these other austere environments.
I mean, and I am in fact absolutely impressed by the fact that you went and did hot yoga for 5 to 6 weeks to prepare yourself for a deployment. That's,
Like a weirdo, I will say. I mean, sure, DC is a military town, but you're not supposed to wear your uniform on the metro and be a target, but here I was showing up in a yoga studio outside of
not only
Capitol
that, in the
Hill.
back of the yoga studio.
Oh, I was in the hottest part of the studio every time, which is usually the sun.
Yeah, those environments are no fun, especially if you go there, you haven't done both invasions. So what is the most interesting fact about Dr. Allison Breger?
Well, I guess I'd say more or less my, like, proudest accomplishment is being so Bernie Kosar and I are inducted into the same Hall of Fame, which is my high school Hall of Fame, because Bernie Kosar went to my high school. So and I actually have a picture from when I got inducted for track and field with Bernie.
Really? So you still hold some state records?
Actually, I don't hold any records anymore. So that was the thing about being the first is like every meet I set a new record. I had the indoor state record for a while, but actually the reigning Olympic champion, Katie Moon, she is from Cleveland, Ohio. And I was actually coaching high school track at a nearby high school when she was competing in high school, but she had broken most of the like regional and district records that I had and probably, like, still has the state records and
In pole
stuff.
vaulting?
And pole vault, yeah. Yeah, so this is
Wow.
this is, if you can see Bernie and I.
Congratulations. How
Yeah.
tall are you?
I'm 5'5", which is tall for a gymnast. Bernie's really tall. I was not expecting him to be so tall.
I was thinking pole vaulters, when you see them at the Olympics, all the guys are like, well, they look like they're
The
6
guys
foot.
are tall. Yeah,
Yeah, they're very lanky.
when I was stationed at Bragg, I used to coach at a club up in Raleigh, and we actually had Duplantis, the Swedish guy who finally broke Sergei Bubka's like 40-year-old record. Come, he's really tall. The women are short because most of us were gymnasts in a previous life.
Really? So that's like the follow-on career for a gymnast is moving
It
into pole
is.
vaulting, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I could have done gymnastics in college, not Division 1, like a Division 3 school, but I think my body, after 17, 18, it was done with gymnastics,
Let
especially
me
since
tell you, and
consistency.
start taking care of that body because I'm in my 60s right now. I've got rotator cuff surgery coming up. I've got lower back surgery. It catch you, and I played rugby all the way up into my early 60s. So
Oh, wow.
it's yeah, yeah. I just kind of love it. Just
I understand. I still pole vault. So I do coach at a club, but I also pole vault with my athletes too. So I compete in like masters track and field. I do CrossFit too. Competed in the CrossFit games a few times
did
on a
you?
team, not as an individual on a team years ago. But that's really how I just try to stay fit and injury free.
Staying fit's one thing, but the hurting yourself, carrying them sandbags around is another issue.
Yeah.
Uh, Doc, this has been an amazing conversation, man. So before we close out every show, I love to give my guests time to talk about themselves. Where can people find you? Some of the studies that you're coming out, and what's next for you? Where do you go from West Point and there? So go ahead and talk away.
Sure. So I guess, yeah, you can find me on social media. I'm not on Twitter or yeah, I have a profile on LinkedIn. I quite honestly only check it like once a month. But I am active on Instagram. It's Doc Jock ZZZ.
Okay.
And I do have and I'll send you a copy. I got to get more books. I have a popular science book I wrote over a decade ago called Meathead Unraveling the Athletic Brain. More or less is a neuroscience textbook for athletes. So it talks about how the brain goes from developing into a youth sport athlete into a professional athlete and what happens in the brain from decision making to risk taking to emotional regulation. Also has a significant focus on exercise and the importance of exercise for reducing risk for Alzheimer's and neurodegeneration, also reducing and improving mental health. And there's also a chapter on sleep as well as like using legal performance enhancers like caffeine, how that is like, I think, an underutilized or underappreciated thing for cognitive function during sports. So, yeah, you can find it on Amazon. Beyond that, yeah, if you want to look up any of my studies, all my studies are publicly available. Outside of the ones I've done with organizations that you've worked for. And you can find those on Google Scholar. And after this, yeah, I'm just hoping to go back to the community that you were a part of for a long period of time. You know, it really is a special community. I do miss it. I do get to do some things here. Like tomorrow, I get to participate in a role playing exercise, which I'm like super excited about to have some interface with, people from Fort Bragg and stuff. But yeah, that's my plan is to, keep serving my country and helping your teammates be the best they can be, but make sure that they're doing it safely, and that they're protecting themselves short term and long term.
Well, Doctor, this has been amazing. And just so you know, let us know. I'll be talking about this in the closing edits, but we'd love to continue working with you. If you have, anything you need from the foundation, please reach out. We've just won several grants down here to provide free ketamine treatments and brain supplementation programs. We'd like to turn these into studies. So we're very focused on, and this is for veterans, and then on youth sports. I mean, this is one of the few dual youth sports and military conversations I've had on this podcast. It was a wonderful surprise, and I thank you so much for coming on the show. And I look forward to seeing you at the tailgate. I'll talk about that, the
Yeah.
Army Navy game, and because we'll be down there if you're going to be around.
House literally overlooks the rugby field. Like we hear practice every single day. When it's 4:30, I get home from work and I'm taking out our dog. Like I can hear the both men's and women's team yelling. So
God,
yeah,
women's. Yeah, I got into a very, well, not a loud argument, but one of the women doctors at a TBI conference got up and, she was backed by World Rugby and the NFL. And she got up there in front of this whole new group of brain people, right? And she's like, well, and I've been told by the rugby players that if you're not tackling, it's not rugby. And she was up there actively condoning that girls start tackling at the age of 8 in rugby. And of course, with that young athlete that ran over everybody in the Olympics, rugby is the fastest growing women's sport in this country right now.
it
Yet,
is. Yep. My former boss at my last job, his daughter, she was the all army athlete, Sammy Sullivan.
oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I worked for her
Yeah.
in my last job. He's a
Beast, man.
retired Green Beret, I think. I don't know if you knew that.
Who's that?
Mike Sullivan, her dad.
Oh, Mike Sullivan. Yeah, dude. Mike was my coach on All Army years and years ago, man. It was the same Mike Sullivan. Yeah. Yeah, it's just another, because when I was down in Australia, the problem that we have between US football and rugby is that most kids are done playing football at high school. Very few make it to double one. There's no football teams out here. I mean, very few. It costs a lot of money for all that patch. With rugby, All you need is a pair of cleats. They're a pair of boots, man. You get on the field. And I'm actually part of that with my own mental health issues after playing for so long. And but it's something that we do have to watch for. But Dr. Breger, thank you so much for your time today. I want to thank you so much for your service to our country, to our veterans, and congratulations on all the success that you have. I've got it down to order your book, and I'll go ahead and do a review on that. And I look forward to helping you in any way you can we can with your mission. And
Well, I really appreciate time with you too. It's the best part of my day for sure.
all right. Well, may the Lord bless you, and you take care of yourself.
Thank you so
Folks,
much.
no problem, ma'am. Folks, another wonderful show. And these are the amazing conversations that we have that could just make you more informed to make better decisions or to understand that people, and we get calls all the time from men and women in their 30s, 40s, and 50s that are starting to understand why they're suffering now and how we can help them because there's all kinds of treatments out there. So as we keep going, I want to say thank you to everybody, Dr. Breger and the team for producing this wonderful podcast. Don't forget the book, the only book for parents that I had to write. Okay, it's available for free on our website, Youth Contact Sports and Broken Brains. Please take a look at it. Please read it. 88 pages. Get smart on the issues so that you're not listening to influencers, because if it's on the internet, it's not exactly true sometimes. So you can think for yourself, all right? And then like the podcast, spread the podcast around, share it, please. Let everybody know that we're out there just trying to make a difference, and we appreciate all your support. Remember, for those of you with children, and for yourself, if you're an athlete, you only got one melon, please take care of it. May the Lord bless you all. Take care. From me, your host, Bruce Parkman, and the Mac Parkman Foundation. We'll talk to you later. God bless.